Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and welcome to Inside the Writer's Studio, the podcast where we talk with writers about their lives, their craft, their business, and their latest work. I'm your host, Charlie Lovett, and our podcast is sponsored by Bookmarks. Bookmarks is a literary nonprofit whose programs include the largest annual book festival in the Carolinas. Come visit Bookmarks at our community gathering space and nonprofit independent bookstore in downtown Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Inside the Writer's Studio is also proud to be an affiliate of Libro FM, the audiobook platform that supports your local independent bookstore. Stay tuned at the end of the podcast for more information on Libro FM and a special offer. My guest today is Lauren Nossett, whose debut novel, The Resemblance, has just been published. Lauren, welcome to Inside the Writer's Studio.
Thanks so much for having me, Charlie.
So when I first got the blurb about this novel from your publicist, it described The Resemblance as belonging to a genre called dark academia. And I'll be honest, I'd never heard the phrase dark academia before. So tell us, what does that mean?
So it's a tradition that I think we could say stems from the campus novel. You know, the campus novel has been around for a while, but now post, I would say, Donna Tartt's The Secret History, which is, I think this year is its 30th year anniversary. We have this genre that takes place on a college campus, but really highlights the dark themes and sinister events that can happen when you have a group of young people, or sometimes, you know, a faculty body that is somewhat insular and isolated and spends a lot of time together, is often competitive in nature, whether that's through academics or Greek life organizations or other things going on the college campuses that may lend itself to mystery, murder, and mayhem.
Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about your own campus experience and how it sort of led to the writing of this novel.
Yeah, so I've spent the past 15 years or so on college campuses as first a student for a very long time. I did a bachelor's and a master's at the University of Georgia. I also taught there for a little bit as an instructor. And of course, The Resemblance takes place on the University of Georgia's campus. And then I did my PhD at UC Davis, which was another large research university. And then I taught as a professor, but at smaller liberal arts colleges. So at Elon University, and then also at Randolph-Macon College. So I've really seen both sides of the country, East and West, and then a variety in terms of college sizes. I'll say the mystery that we have happen in The Resemblance could not happen at a smaller university. This has to happen, I think, at a large university. And then in terms of Greek life too, I, of course, as a student, attended Greek life parties, had a lot of friends in Greek life. I myself was not in Greek life. As a grad student, I lived next to a fraternity house. And so that was its own individual experience. And then, of course, I've taught students who participated in Greek life and at institutions where Greek life played a large role.
Yeah. I was just teaching a class at Elon the other day. So it was the first,
really?
I taught there before in their extension program, but this was the first time I had a break and I could kind of wander around the campus, and it's beautiful. But as you say, it's a very different kind of feel from something like the University of Georgia. Tell us why particularly you wanted to pick that university. And also, were there points where you had to sort of play around with the geography or anything like that to fit your novel, or did you try to be really true to the university itself?
So I think I'll answer the first part of the question about why UJ in particular, and then I'll talk a little bit about the campus and the buildings that feature in the novel. So to me, as someone who really likes this genre, I noticed as a reader of the genre that you often find these college campus settings at places like Oxford or New England liberal arts colleges, even colleges the size of Elon and a kind of location. Elon has a beautiful campus, right, with all the brick architecture and ivy crawling up the buildings. It's just stunning. And then it's somewhat isolated. It's in a small town where the university is a big part of what's there. a big research university is just very different in terms of the feel, even things like football culture, which doesn't play as big of a role in the novel, but its location in Athens, which has its own downtown, right? It just is a very different location than I think what you find in other campus novels. So that interested me, and then I wanted to play around with what this looks like at a bigger university. And then in terms of the setting, I spent a lot of time on the campus. While I was writing, I wasn't living in Georgia. I was living in Virginia, but I have family here. And so would come back to Georgia and would visit the campus. It is all the university buildings that are mentioned. They do exist. I, walked kind of around the university to make sure that things made sense. I drove some of the streets in question that play a role in the novel to make sure what I was saying and how I remembered, that all played out as I remember. Although I will say that I think the Athens that is represented there, and even the university, has a kind of nostalgic tinge in my mind. It's really the Athens of, 10, 15 years ago when I was there, more so than it is, I think, the Athens and University of today. There's buildings now that didn't exist when I was a student there. And I will say there's been more safety initiatives in place on some of the streets and questions, like stop signs and stoplights and stuff like that too.
So without giving any spoilers, tell us a little bit about the resemblance and about the main character.
So the resemblance is, as you said, it's in that dark academia genre. It's a campus novel. It starts out with our lead detective, Marlette Kaplan. She's on campus visiting her mother, who is a university professor. She teaches German at the university. And she is essentially first on the scene to this fatal hit and run that takes place on the university campus. And for her own personal reasons and some of her own experiences while she herself was in college, she immediately suspects that the university's Greek life plays a role in this death, which she finds suspicious. And then so that leads her into investigations into that world.
Mm-hmm. Now, so a lot of the books I read, and this was one, this was the case too, I'm reading these advanced digital copies, and so I don't have the same impact with the cover of the book as if I were holding a copy in my hand. But I did see the cover of this book, and both the cover and the first few sentences really evoke autumn. I'm sitting here right now with beautiful leaves falling outside my window. Why was that the right season, and why did you want to sort of be sure that we knew going into the book that that's where we were for this particular story?
I think when I think of a campus novel in dark academia, I immediately think fall. Of course, we have both fall and spring semesters. They both exist in college. Sometimes you take a summer term. But for me, that back to school atmosphere, and this too is someone who is from Georgia and it takes place in Georgia. It's really still hot when you go back to school in Georgia. And I can remember teaching and just, sweating on the way to class. It can still be 90 degrees in, early September here, but that's again why this is placed in November. So we actually have the falling leaves and that atmosphere. I think it plays into the dark themes of dark academia too. The days are getting shorter. It's the sweater weather where you want to be indoors. There's something, of course, cozy about that, but there's something sinister too as the nighttime hours are lengthening. There are, of course, parties that are extending late into the evening too, as well on university campus, in addition to late night cramming or whatever else the students are getting into.
Yeah. So whenever I'm talking about a thriller or a mystery, we tend to focus more on the beginning of the book because we don't want to give anything away. And I remember having this discussion with my editor for one of my books where I had written a prologue. And then my agent said, I think it's better without the prologue. So I took the prologue away. And then we were in editing, and my editor said, would you consider writing a prologue? And we had kind of gone back and forth. But this book does have a prologue. And I wonder if you could sort of give us your thoughts on the whole idea of the prologue, why you wanted to use it, why it worked particularly well in this novel.
So it's funny that you say that because I actually had a similar experience in that I wrote this prologue last.
Mhm.
Uh, this I had a different prologue, something that actually happens without any spoilers midway through the novel now, right before the transition to the second part. That was the first prologue. And so we moved that prologue so it was more chronologically in line. So instead of it being a flashback in terms of what was going on in the plot, it was then, placed directly in the plot when it happened. This prologue too is a flashback, but it's to something much earlier that happens. And I think for thrillers, a lot of times you want something that hooks the reader. And because for me, I wanted the initial chapter to start with a focus on Athens and the setting and the college campus. That's a bit of a slower start when you're describing all of that beautiful setting, yes, but it's not as exciting as putting you into the action right away. So if you don't start your first chapter that way, a prologue is a good way to jump into some action, even if it's a flashback, before you get into the mystery. And then, of course, the other descriptions.
Well, of course, you say you start with what's kind of exploring Athens and with the university, and that means you also sort of immediately delve into the troublesome history of Southern institutions. How does the background of cruelty, of racism, of slavery, of all that provide context for what's going to happen in this novel?
I think it's a really again, as a campus novel, and the book wants to exist within that genre, but also critique it, right? Because often in campus novels or even dark academia, well, maybe that's what the difference is. I think dark academia allows you to kind of critique these prestigious institutions by examining darker themes or by examining the ways in which universities, which have been traditionally and historically places of privilege, and where privileged students go, that started as institutions that only allowed not only white but land owning members to attend, students to attend. So it's not just racial, but it's also class. And of course, women weren't initially able to attend either. So I think by starting with that way, by using this genre that highlights how such institutions can allow for a continuation of those systems of power that can be abused, are abused, that's something that we can examine within this genre. And in particular, the Southern universities, and it's not only UGA, but a lot of this is a conversation that has been going on for, especially in the last few years, the names that are on college university buildings and how we still haven't really had a real conversation. And in my mind, the university is a good place to have those conversations, and we still really haven't done that.
Yeah, I know certainly I went to Davidson College, which is also in the South and was also founded, before the Civil War. And they are having very, very long and serious conversations about names of buildings and, sort of facing up to the early history of the institution where slavery was a part of what was going on then in the 1830s in the South. In addition to that history, though, you also paint at times a pretty stark portrait of academia. You say, I'm gonna pull a few quotes here, that it's a place of vicious departmental meetings, infighting and backstabbing, petty gossip, adjuncts living in poverty, underage drinking, sexual assault, hazing, cheating, lying. Sort of a two-part question, like how bad is the situation on campuses today? And also, like, how, you alluded to this a little earlier, how disconnected is academia from, for want of a better term, the real world?
Yeah, I think, well, first I have to say that is Marlette speaking and not me. So
Yes, no, I understand. Yeah.
the detective, she has, but it is, of course, this first person narration. I have this history, of course, with having spent a long time at the university on both sides as a student and professor. She is much, I think I see a bit more nuance with everything. in the world in which she exists than she herself does. She has very strong opinions. She was very fun to write, I will say, because she has these strong opinions. But for me, even the things she says about Greek life, I see much more nuance than I think she does. And I try to put, in terms of Greek life, other characters in the novel that provide a counterbalance to just how strong her opinions are, and even members of the fraternity themselves who don't conform to this really rigid picture that she has of Greek life for her own personal reasons. But yeah, I think right now there is a huge crisis in academia, both in terms of the labor force. There was an opinion piece recently in the New York Times that really highlighted this, and also talking about dark academia, this turn to an adjunct labor force, a contingent faculty force, where you have a lot of faculty members, professors who are living in poverty, as they teach these students who are often, some are privileged, but some are also really taking on a lot of debt in order to attend the college campuses. And there are increasing, so I left teaching in 2021 was my last year teaching. And that was right, the last semester I taught, it was still online, it was remote teaching. And so it was during COVID, but even before that, we were really seeing an increase in student alienation, isolation, rates of depression on campus that the university and colleges are struggling to keep up with. So they're not able to provide, or they haven't provided the mental health services to meet the needs of the students. And that's another huge problem when you think about these students who are often away from home. They're away from their support networks, the people that they would turn to, who then maybe are having crises and then are having to wait a week, right? But without parents to turn to, maybe the friends that they have back home to turn to. So I think there's a lot to talk about in those terms too, and the university could be doing a better job to address those things.
Yeah, we have a friend who just started as a freshman at a large state university, and we saw her, she was home, and we're like, oh, how are you home so soon? And she goes, well, it's a mental health day. And so they were actually giving them, I think it's one day a month where they give them a longer weekend. And because it's a state university, many of the students are in state and can therefore go home for a couple of days. And we'll see what the effectiveness of something like that is. Now, you alluded to Marlette's attitude towards Greek life, and you said that your own attitude is a little more nuanced. Give us a taste of what her attitude is and how you see it in a little more nuanced way, because I think your nuanced attitude does come out somewhat, behind, not necessarily in Marlette's voice, but in the things that play out.
Yes, I hope that even though she has really strong opinions, that there are other voices, there are other characters who argue for the benefits of Greek life. And speaking to what we were just talking about, mental health, students feeling isolated and alienated on campus, Greek life can provide that community for students who wouldn't otherwise have met other people. Even my mother was in a sorority at the University of Georgia, and she will, it's hard for me to believe it because she will talk to anyone and everyone now, but as a student, she was incredibly shy, and she really feels like she wouldn't have had any friends were it not for the members of her sorority, some of whom she still keeps in touch with, does things with. And so for me, I see that nuance. I see that it can provide that community for students who really, really need it. At the same time, and this is put into the voice of Marlette, I also do know the statistics. I do watch the news. I do see that at least one member of fraternity has died every year, for the last, I don't know, several decades. There are higher rates of sexual assault that happen. Women in sororities are more likely to be victims of sexual assault. So there are real issues that need to be addressed. The culture of course, binge drinking, which is what leads to a lot of these fraternity-related deaths. All of these things are things that need to change. And for Marlette, so switching to her perspective, she's someone who grew up in a college town surrounded by this environment. So that in and of itself, I think gives her, and she just is the type of person who has strong opinions by nature, but she really being surrounded by this from a young age, her mother working at the university, living in this small town, college town, has these opinions, but then she herself has had an experience that has really shaped the way that she's sees Greek life, and she sees no gray area when it comes to Greek life. Where other characters that she comes into contact with, and members of the fraternity themselves. So there's Tripp, who's one of the fraternity members who just wants to help the investigation, who's on scholarship. There's another character named Cade, and he just wants to hang out with his girlfriend, so there are characters that she's coming into contact with who actually don't conform to what she thinks, but she has a really strong opinion that's going to be hard to sway her.
Yeah. And Marla actually even collects these examples of Greek misbehavior and tragedy and cruelty. And the fact that she is so single-minded in that at times isolates her from both the people she's investigating and the people who are assisting in her investigation. I think there are great advantages to having an isolated protagonist in a thriller, but I wonder if you would sort of share your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think that's for me too, as a reader. That's the kind of protagonist I want to root for, is the one who has a troubled backstory, or as frustrated as you get with some of their actions, they are on a mission. And I think it's fun to follow that kind of character who has really strong opinions and a really strong agenda, and they're not going to let anything get in their way. So yes, for me, that's, I think, a lot of my favorite detectives or thriller heroes and heroines. They fall into that kind of trope.
Yeah. Now, let's talk about writing and research a little bit. I think I've been going on tour a lot lately with my latest novel, which is a thriller, and I get this question about, where do you find out this, or how do you research that? And one of the ways I begin to answer that question is to say, I think as writers, I think I can speak for the group when I say that none of us want the FBI to go look in our search history. Right. You seem to know an awful lot about what happens to a dead body in the first few minutes after death, and some things like that. So tell us a little bit about your research into the world of death, of murder, of investigation, aside from the college setting, but just how those things sort of play out.
Yes, I think you're right. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine what writing this novel would look like pre-Google, right? I Google everything, and I would hate, if someone was staring over my shoulder and seeing what I was Googling, they would really, I think, wonder about my state of mind. But yeah, I read a lot of, and that's also the beauty too, is that, so a lot of police officers, even detectives, have written blog post on a day in the life, right? What their day-to-day existence looks like. You can, of course, Google what happens. So what happens in a pedestrian accident or a pedestrian fatality. All of those were things that I looked up. And then there's some other things that happened that I did a lot of research, but I think they might be a spoiler to reveal. But yeah, so there's just a lot that I think you can now find out just by reading online and by reading about people's experiences online.
And then you have this idea of Greek life and the fraternity, where there are huge parts of that life where sort of the whole point of them is that they are kept secret from outsiders. And both you as a writer and Marla as the investigator have to try to crack through that facade. Without spoilers, were you able to find out a little bit about what happens behind that curtain, or are you just imagining it based on sort of general ideas?
Well, I remember, I think it was in a master class by Margaret Atwood. She talked about writing The Handmaid's Tale. And she said that one of her rules for herself in writing The Handmaid's Tale was that anything that she put into that story had to have happened at somewhere, someplace in time, so that she couldn't be accused of having kind of this twisted mind that just invented these things. And so I tried to apply that rule for myself and for this story. So a lot of what's talked about in the novel, and you mentioned that line where Marlette talks about that she collects these stories, these horrible stories, those were pulled from the headlines. Those are things that happened, like the rape bait email and stuff like that from the Georgia Tech fraternity. Those are all things that were in the news, and there have been fraternity members who have written pieces on what their experiences were after the fact, right after they've left. There's a great book by I think it's John Heschinger called True Gentlemen, and he spent 2 years going to different fraternity meetings, spending a lot of time investigating these different fraternity related deaths that had happened. That provided a really good resource and a lot of good context into kind of the nuance of, yes, it is providing this community, but and it is it's a culture that needs to change. And I also, as I had friends who were in fraternities, I had friends who were willing to share some things with me too. I witnessed things when I went to fraternity parties, when I myself was a student. So it's everything except for, I think, perhaps the kind of main events. And there's a scene, well, even that is somewhat inspired of, everything's inspired by something except for, I think, the central mystery. And so that was my way to follow that rule by Margaret Atwood.
So this novel begins, as you said, the question in this novel is posed very early on, and when this supposedly accident, but we suspect maybe it's not an accident, takes place, and the question is who is this person? Why did they die? What are the specific circumstances? Tell us a little bit about how you structure the book. Did you know the answer to that question before you started writing, and how do you manage the flow of information in a mystery? When do you decide it's time for the reader to know something, and when is it time to withhold things from them?
Yeah, I think throughout a thriller, you're asking and answering a lot of questions. There's the main question of who did it, but then there's all the I guess red herrings, we could say, that you throw in there, but then you also need to answer those questions too. You can't leave those red herrings open-ended. So I think starting with that question at the beginning, that's maybe also what marks a thriller, because that really ramps up the pace of having this inciting incident, so to speak. The story came to me in two parts. The first was in Marlette's voice. It was that prologue that I mentioned earlier that was initially meant to be the prologue, but then ended up happening about midway through. And I saw that whole scene. I heard it in her voice. I would say more, but I feel like it's a bit of a spoiler. So it started with her and her voice. I just heard it very clearly. And then I had the more central mystery idea that came to me separately. And so to a certain extent, it was melding those two. I knew to a certain extent the why and the how, but then it was connecting those pieces. And I will say, I have this bad habit where I just want to write, and I get about 60,000 words in, and then I'm like, an outline would have been good. And so, I've written all this, and then especially with the thriller, because you're right, the plotting is so important. Then I find myself, okay, laying out, what do I have? Actually, does everything make sense in this order? Would it be more suspenseful if I moved certain questions around, certain answers around? And I still, there will be a second book in this series. I was a little bit better at outlining that one, but I'm now working on another book that it's like I didn't learn from my mistakes. And I'm now at that part where I have 70,000 words and I'm having to go back and make an outline, and it's a mess. And I know everyone has a different process, but one day maybe I'll learn and I'll start with an outline, but to this day I haven't done that.
One of the ways that I connected with your main character is that Marlette and myself are both faculty kids. My dad taught English here at Wake Forest for 40 years, and I grew up in that world where, as a faculty child, you're kind of like part of the university and then also not part of the university. And I wondered if you could talk about how you take advantage of that duality as Marlett moves through the novel.
So I love that you grew up in that world, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that probably does give you a perspective. And I think for me, because Marlett's mother is a German professor, which is what I was, it was a way for me to pull in what, they say to write what you know. And so it was a way to pull in what I knew. But because she, as you said, she isn't a part of the university. She didn't even attend the University of Georgia. She went to Georgia State, right, which is in Atlanta, and it's a completely different kind of institution. And so she has an outsider's perspective, but with some internal knowledge, right? From witnessing these things, from hearing her mother talk about the issues that she sees on campus, from just being immersed in that world. And yet, because she has this outsider knowledge, she can provide some of the critiques that either aren't visible from within, or of course, there can be higher stakes from voicing those critiques from within. So she has a different perspective and a little bit different voice in order to do that.
And of course, the other thing that's quite obvious about Marlett is her gender. And I think gender plays a kind of an important role in this novel. How does it work for her? I mean, is she treated differently because of her gender? And how does she deal with that, or has she dealt with that in the past?
So in the force, we know her boss, the Lieutenant Barry Truman, he himself has very specific ideas of the roles of men and women in society, but also men and women in the force. And his behavior, I think he would argue, is chivalrous, but really for Marlett, it comes across as quite patronizing, right? He wants to protect her from the worst cases, protect her from violence, which again, in his mind, is he's doing her a favor, but in her mind, she's being treated differently than her partner, Teddy, who's a man, and then also Oliver, who's another detective that they work closely with. And this is a big source of frustration for her, and I think also adds to her really feeling as if she needs to prove herself, but also her tendency to work outside the lines because she feels like the lines have been drawn differently for her.
Mm-hmm. To go back to craft for a second, every now and then I just have to write down sentences because they just jump out at me, and I love it. And I just love the sound of this sentence. Most days aren't occupied by murder and manhunts, but by paperwork and politics. Now, I'm one of those people who believes there's a lot of space for alliteration in writing. Some people are like, no alliteration, but I like the way words sound. I'm fascinated by that. How important is that to you, the sound of what you're writing? And at what point in the writing process does that kick in? Is that from the very beginning, or is that in revision or editorial?
Well, thank you, because I love talking about the structure of sentences and the rhythm of sentences.
Yeah.
I think that's probably what I spend the most time worrying over, rereading. I read it out loud to see how it sounds. I really think that, it's not only poetry that can have a focus and an attention to words and sound and rhythm, but that prose can too. In fact, one of there was an early review, I think on Instagram, where someone said that there was almost an anal attention to the writing style or something. And I thought, yes, there is. I spent so much time thinking about these things. So yeah, I agree. I think sometimes when I'm first writing, it's just get my thoughts out on the page. But certainly even the first round of me going back, I'm really thinking about, okay, how can I make this sound the best? And I think sometimes I even put near rhymes in the prose. And I have had to go back and say, okay, like this is getting too much. You don't need this. It doesn't need to be this rhymey. This is starting to sound a bit strange. But I think a lot about the sound, and I do one way to see whether or not it sounds right is that I read it out loud and see how it sounds out loud.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful thing. My most recent novel, I was finished with the manuscript right about the time we got locked down. And so I did what I'd never done before. I always give it to my wife to read, but this time I read it out loud to her, and it was great. I mean, we both found all kinds of things that were ripe for improvement. There's other lines that I write down, not necessarily because of the way they sound, although these lines sound great, but because of their content. And this was one that really struck me. You write, they lie because lying is second nature. All day long, they're telling stories about who they are, why they do what they do, where they're always the hero of their own narrative. We all do it. I mean, fiction itself is a lie. So this is kind of a meta question, but I mean, to what extent is lying a part of human nature, and how do we harness that as fiction writers?
Yeah, I think truth and lies are something that when I was writing this, I was thinking a lot about. I started writing it in 2018, and all of the sudden, and maybe this is naive of me, but as a child, you grow up and there's a clear distinction between truth and lies. And then it felt very much so that all of a sudden those distinctions were being erased, and someone could lie. And just if they kept insisting that what they said was the truth, even if they were caught in the lie, even if there was evidence presented otherwise, it was still presented as people could have their own truths. And so I think that's something I was just in general thinking about when I was working on the novel is this distinction and what is truth. And then you're right, fiction in itself is completely made up. So it is a lie. And how do you challenge that from within?
Yeah. I mean, one of the other things that I find among the most disturbing that goes on in academia these days is this sort of rampant cheating that seems to be just accepted at every level. You have one character who's talking about cheating who says, what if it doesn't catch up with them? What if they cheat, get away with it, and keep doing it? What kind of lesson is that? And thrillers and detective stories are usually about finding the person who has done something wrong and then punishing them for the thing that they've done wrong. And maybe they'll learn a lesson, or maybe they'll spend the rest of their lives in prison or whatever. But obviously, there are too many misdeeds in the world for them to all go punished. What truth do you get at by talking about cheaters who never get caught?
Yeah, I think that and again, as a professor, this is something you think about too, because of course you are there to teach the subject that you're teaching, but you are also aware that students are learning life lessons in your classroom, right? At this pivotal age. And I think that's what Marlit is. I think I'm not sure who says it, if it's Marlit, thinking about this, or if it's another. But I think that's what she's getting at, that there are these young people at this time of their life where they are soaking up information. They're learning, not just the subjects in their classroom, but also these real truths and life lessons. And that if there's no consequence to cheating, what does that mean, as they move forward in life and into the quote unquote real world outside of the university? And I think we see in the novel and in other events that take place, actually, if this is reinforced, that you can break the rules and get away with it, that there are higher stakes, right, that are at play.
I find it odd that people spend tens of thousands of dollars to go to a university to get educated and then refuse to be educated and just copy somebody else's education. I don't know, that's not one I can quite wrap my head around. But okay, so I'm going to go one more passage. Obviously, I liked the writing in this book because I keep quoting passages. And this is just one for you to unpack for us a little bit. I think this is the protagonist talking, but I write these things down when I'm in a hurry and I come across them in the book. But here it is. The tightrope walker is careful, every fiber of her being attuned to the vibration of the rope, the expanse of air beneath her feet. The rest of us are just racing across shingles, too sure of our own purpose to secure a lifeline before we're tumbling backward into nothingness. Just talk to us a little bit about what's going on in that passage.
So it's interesting because when you read that passage, I actually had a very vivid image in my head, because something outside my window when I was sitting at my desk inspired that line. And I was watching my neighbors across the street were having their roof redone. And I was watching the roofers run across again, just, with not no harness, no nothing, just run across the roof as they were throwing off shingles. And I was just mesmerized by that. But then I, of course, thought, well, how can I use this? And that inspired that line. But I think also, yeah, it's that idea of there are certain people who will, they will safety strap, they will harness, they will do everything, they'll think 3 steps ahead, and that's how they approach life. And then there are other types of people who don't, and who will, either at risk to themselves, at risk to other people, without fear or thought of the consequence, can move through life that way. And in Marlitte's mind, at times, I think this is a kind of privilege to move through life that way without thought of consequence, for your own safety or for others.
Yeah. And privilege is certainly something, and we touched on this in several ways, that comes into this novel in a lot of different ways. And we see people who have different types of privilege. It's not just the sort of the obvious ones. And there's just a lot to unpack here. I think readers are going to have a great time with this. I'm glad to know there's a second one coming along. I'm actually headed to a conference on a great big college campus this weekend, so I'm going to be really careful while I'm crossing the street, I promise. We like to end every episode of Inside the Writer's Studio with the same 10 questions. You should be able to answer each of them in just a few words, but hopefully you'll give our listeners a little insight into you and into your writing. So if you're ready, we will begin.
Right.
What word do you love to work into your writing?
Truth, but maybe more as a concept to what we were just talking about than for it as a word, but truth as a concept.
Okay. What word do you hate to encounter in other people's writing?
Bone, used as a metaphor.
Okay. Where's your favorite place to write?
So recently I have some friends, they've been very generous, and they've been letting me go up they have a cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And so I've been going up there, just taking the dog, really isolating myself. And it's of course beautiful this time of year, but it's very peaceful, and it's good for me to write without distraction.
Where could you never write?
In a new city, because I would want to get out and explore, and I don't think I'd be able to sit still long enough to write.
To what rule of grammar do you pay least attention?
Maybe incomplete sentences.
Okay. What was the first book you remember reading?
I have a distinct memory, I think it was in 3rd grade, of going to the school library and wanting to check out The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and being told by the librarian that was a little bit too advanced, I think, for my reading level, and being very proud because I was very confident in my reading skills, and that I insisted that I read the book. And then of course I went on and I read the rest of the series. So it would have to be something from the Chronicles of Narnia.
What are you reading now?
So I just finished The Gargoyle. And I just picked up, and that's by Andrew Davidson. And then I just picked up Welcome to the Goon Squad by Jennifer Egan.
What book would you like to have written?
The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafron. Just as I think anyone who loves books, just captures the magic of reading.
What sort of book would you like to write, but probably never will?
Well, this is a book I'd like to rewrite because I wrote a horrible draft years and years ago. It's a historical fiction novel, which I have much respect for you writing historical fiction and the sheer amount of research, but then not getting bogged down by that research and telling the story. So historical fiction novel on the life of Tusnelda, who was the wife of a Germanic soldier who led the revolution against, or the revolt against, the invading Roman Empire in 9 AD.
Wow. Okay. And finally, what would you like to hear a reader tell you?
Well, I think to a certain extent, you did that for me already, where you really talked about the writing. And I think for me to be able to dive deep, and I am a former literature professor, so I really love to dive deep into the language. So I think that that they had that appreciation on a sentence level for my work. That would be something that I really really wanted to hear. But I think anytime a reader tells you that they stayed up all night reading, that's obviously a huge compliment. So.
Yeah. Well, this has been Inside the Writer's Studio. I'm your host, Charlie Lovett, and my guest today has been Lauren Nossett, whose novel, The Resemblance, is available wherever books are sold. Lauren, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Charlie.
Inside the Writer's Studio is sponsored by Bookmarks, a literary nonprofit that runs the largest annual book festival in the Carolinas and operates a community gathering place and nonprofit independent bookstore in downtown Winston-Salem, North Carolina. To find out more about Bookmarks and all its programs, visit www.bookmarksnc.org. Inside the Writer's Studio is proud to be affiliated with Libro FM. Unlike other audiobook platforms, Libro FM supports your local independent bookstore. Whether you buy a single book or, like me, a monthly subscription, you can link your account to your local store or to Bookmarks to support literary community. For a special 2-for-1 offer, go to libro.fm and use the discount code WRITERS. If you've enjoyed Inside the Writer's Studio, please consider leaving a rating or review online at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Inside the Writer's Studio posts new episodes on the 1st and 15th of every month. The holidays are almost upon us, so I'll be taking a break from the podcast during December, but I'll be back in January with all new episodes. Until then, thanks for joining us, and may you read with wonder and write with passion.